In this lesson series, we'll tell the amazing story of the origin and evolution of life on Earth. So our first Blue Book diagram then sets the stage. We have our Sun and the Earth, and we have the Drake equation here. And this kind of gives us a context of some of the events that have to happen in order for intelligent communicating life to evolve in the universe. We'll focus on the N sub E term, and this is the term, the number of habitable worlds in a solar system. Well, the Earth is habitable because it's at an orbital distance that allows liquid water to exist on the surface. The Earth is massive enough that it can retain its atmosphere, so gravity keeps the atmosphere. So we have a situation here where we have all the ingredients for lots of interesting chemistry to be going on for hundreds of millions of years. Now, Earth is what we call a rocky planet. And so rocky planets do have a history, going all the way back to the origin of the universe itself. You'll recall that the Big Bang produced lots of hydrogen gas and some helium. And these gases condensed to form stars. And stars are so hot and the pressure is so great in their cores that nuclear fusion begins to happen and heavier elements are created in the cores of stars. And when stars explode, they create even heavier elements, so atoms with more protons and neutrons in the nucleus. And then the explosions eject those heavier elements back into the mix of interstellar gas. But now we have not just hydrogen and helium, but what we call gas and dust. And it's the gas and dust that then can form second and third and fourth generation solar systems with rocky planets. So the sun is mostly hydrogen and helium, but now because of previous generations of stars and stellar explosions, we have heavier elements that form the rocky planets, and Earth is one of those rocky planets. So now we're setting the stage for the emergence of life. So if we think about the early Earth, it might have had a to-do list. Number one, calm down. And what do we mean by calm down? Well, the early Earth was very, very hostile. We still had lots of bombardments from asteroids and meteors and comets and things, and it was extremely hot, and it was just a hostile place. Again, lifeless. There was no life here yet. So we'll say calm down, and that took several 100 million years. Get strange, because something strange is about to happen, and that's the formation of life on Earth. Now, we know today that all living things are composed of cells, and the list of characteristics that these living things, these units called cells, can do are shown here. They're organized, self-maintaining, they acquire energy, they respond to the environment, they can reproduce, and they evolve adaptations. And again, the idea here for biologists, all of the boxes must be checked for something to be alive. Cells are the smallest units on Earth that satisfy all these characteristics. Now, how is it happening? Well, in our movie, One Strange Rock, we sort of saw the simple idea here that what you need, you got to have some stardust, and these would be atoms like carbon and oxygen and nitrogen formed from stars, formed inside stars and their explosions. You got to have it in water. Water is a great solvent. It allows a lot of things to dissolve in it so they can interact. So we've got chemistry going on in the water. We've got a chamber for the chemistry to happen in so that the materials are confined, they're concentrated, and heat. Heat will then provide the energy to get the chemistry going. So this then would be the kind of abstract notion of what the Earth was. The Earth was a place where lots of interesting chemistry was happening. And out of that chemistry, the first living things emerged. Now over here, I have a die here. So self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. This is sort of NASA's definition of life. And we can ask that question. What were the chances that life would emerge? If we go back to the Drake equation, now we're talking about the fraction of habitable worlds where life emerged on that world. And that remains to be seen. That number is still sort of unknown at this time. But this is the basic idea. You get some stardust in water, supply some heat, and have something to confine the chemical reactions, and you're going to get interesting molecules produced. What kinds of molecules? The ones we find in cells. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. Sugars, lipids with fatty acid tails, and of course DNA. These are complicated molecules. And we should not forget that none of these molecules is alive. So molecules are not alive. Yet cells are alive. Cells are composed of molecules, and the organization of those molecules gives this bacteria cell the capacity to do all the things on the list. Now let's just remind ourselves what bacteria look like. On the left we see some bacteria with a light microscope, and on the right we're using a dark field microscopy situation. This is a special lighting technique. But these are rod-shaped bacteria. And the real long ones here are sort of getting ready to reproduce. So they're going to divide into two shorter cells. So sometimes you see some real short ones here, and they would have been born recently. Here we see a bacteria party, a ball of hundreds of thousands of bacteria cells. And so notice they have they're a little bit different shaped and a little thinner, and there are many different kinds of bacteria on our planet, and they live in every corner of the globe. Here we see, again, a different shape of bacteria, so different size and shape. So bacteria are the most diverse living things on the planet, and this makes sense if they were the first kinds of living things on the planet. They've had a long time to change, to evolve and change into a multitude of different successful single-celled organisms. So if living things are emerging out of non-living molecules, then we have a situation of spontaneous generation. And this is why then we studied two famous experiments in the history of science related to spontaneous generation. And here we'll ask the question, does life spontaneously generate? And our final answer will be, not anymore, but Luca did. Let's see what we mean by that. For a long time, many people thought that living things could spontaneously generate out of non-living stuff, that meat could spontaneously generate into worms, or dirt could turn into bugs and things. In the mid-1800s, Louis Pasteur finally rejected this concept. It was thought that broth, like chicken broth or some kind of meat broth, could spontaneously generate into bacteria. Pasteur argued otherwise. He argued that bacteria existed in the air. Bacteria was everywhere, but also in the air. And if bacteria had a chance to settle down into the broth, it could feed, reproduce, and populate the broth with a bacteria colony. Importantly, Pasteur used a clear broth, so he could see if bacteria were growing without using a microscope. And that was a better technique than his predecessors. Importantly, he fashioned flasks with a curved neck, still open to the air, so if there was a vital force, it could still get down into the broth and whip up some life. But he argued the curve might trap the bacteria. And indeed, the flasks with the curved neck stayed sterile for as long as he saw. In fact, here's a flask still in his museum. It is clear after 150 years. It's as sterile as the day he prepared it, the day he boiled it. This flask shows the bacterial growth. It was the straight neck flask. So for Pasteur, there is no spontaneous generation for bacteria. Bacteria have pre-existing parents. They come from pre-existing bacteria. Now, however, the, of course, big exception to the rule that life doesn't spontaneously generate would be the origin of life. And here in the 1950s, Stanley Miller proposes this apparatus to simulate the early Earth. And he's going to then fashion a flask with some water to simulate the oceans, and another one here, we got some gases in there to simulate the atmosphere, got a spark to simulate lightning, and he's trying to recreate the conditions on the early Earth. Remember, this would have been a rather hostile place, but nevertheless, interesting chemistry might have been going on, and sure enough, after several days, he found that the solution he collected turned kind of brown and found all kinds of complex molecules in there, amino acids and sugars. These are the very molecules found in cells. He did not create a living thing, but he created the molecules that we find in cells. Not DNA, but some of the building blocks of the molecules we find in cells. Let's take a look, let's refresh our memory. What are some of these molecules and how are they related to cells? Well, the membrane of the cell is composed of lipid molecules, and the tails of the lipid molecules are fats. And so these fatty acid type of molecules can form from interesting chemistry. Sugars, like glucose, are an energy molecule for cells. Sugars can be formed from this organic chemistry. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So a protein is a chain of amino acids, and there are 20 different kinds of amino acids. Amino acids have this structure down here, a nitrogen, carbon, carbon, and then the R group here. This is what makes the 20 amino acids different. But this kind of molecule can be produced from interesting organic chemistry. And then, of course, DNA. Now, we're not showing the molecular structure of DNA here, but we are noting that it's a double-stranded molecule. It's twisted, so it's a double helix. And the rungs of the DNA ladder, in a sense, follow the pairing rules. So we call these two strands complementary because whenever there's an A here, there's a T in the other strand, a C in one strand, a G in the other, etc. There are 4 different kinds of these bases, chemical bases, that make up the language of DNA. And we'll return to DNA later. But for right now, the idea is that this kind of entity, this cell, bounded by a membrane with important, complex organic molecules, carbon-rich molecules inside, this was then the origin of life. And scientists suspect that these undersea volcanic vents may have played a key role. Now, there are other scientists who argue that life emerged at different locations, but this is one of the leading contenders. And the reason why this is an exciting discovery is that these volcanic vents, not only do they have a source of energy and simple molecules, but the rocky structures themselves are filled with these tiny chambers, really small little chambers. And that would help solve the dilution problem. Remember, one of the criticisms of Miller was that the ocean would be too big to concentrate the molecules that are formed from this chemistry. Another problem was that he might have used the wrong gases, but the ocean problem, the ocean being too big, would be solved if the origin of life took root in these rocky structures because they're sort of sponge-like, and the walls of the rocky chambers can help to catalyze chemical reactions. It would be the perfect place where lots of interesting chemistry might have been going on. So we do indeed have one strange rock where underneath the oceans, after hundreds of millions of years of chemistry happening in these small little chambers supplied by simple molecules from the Earth's interior, the heat, chemistry going on, we get the formation of complex molecules, and then one day, one fateful day, that assemblage of molecules escaped. Bounded by a membrane, this would have been the origin of life on Earth. Now, we call the living thing that was the last universal common ancestor, we call it LUCA. Now, there might have been other cells that escaped and were alive for a time, but they did not have descendants that led to everything else on Earth, all other living things. So we call LUCA the one that is the ancestor of all of us. We should note that these small little rocky chambers then have a resemblance to our abstract understanding of how life emerged, where the chambers are the pot that will concentrate and confine those important molecules so they can continually interact and produce new and more complex molecules, eventually producing the first living thing. And again, notice then at this stage in the Drake equation, we're at the term F sub I. This is what fraction of habitable worlds did life emerge? Well, on Earth, we know it happened. The question is, did it happen anywhere else in our solar system? Did it happen anywhere else in our galaxy or the universe? So is there anybody out there?